Well, there are some stories. It's hard to decide. My favorite assignment of all time was that when I was sports editor at the Leaf Chronicle in Clarksville. They did a number of national things because that was a good paper. It was very good. It's not much now, but it was a very good paper. I mean, I shouldn't say that. No paper's as good as they used to be, and not just the Leaf Chronicle. I spent my life there and loved it. But they went, because we had a local golfer named Mason Rudolph, who was a pretty famous golfer on the PGA Tour. Every year we would go to the Memphis Open, the Danny Thomas Memphis Classic, or whatever it was called then. And we also would go to the Masters. Well, my first year as sports editor was, I proposed to the bosses that instead, and I went to the Danny Thomas thing and walked with Mason, and I liked him, he was a good guy, and became a dear friend. But I proposed, I said, I really don't think we need to go, the Masters is well covered by everybody else, but I can use that same money, and I know a lot about boxing, and I can use that same money, if I take that money and I apply it toward going to New Orleans to cover the Ali Spinks fight when Ali was trying to win. It was the third time he was not the champion at that time. Leon Spinks was the champion. So he was going to try to reclaim his title as heavyweight champion of the world. I'd been personally, professionally influenced, I think, well, personally influenced by Ali, Muhammad Ali. And also I liked boxing. And so they actually bought that. I wrote this long explanation. If you give me the same amount of money, I can go to New Orleans on the cheap and spend a week in New Orleans and cover the fight. So I did that. They gave in, and so I went to New Orleans, and I booked a kind of a cheap hotel out in the Garden District, and I didn't stay down at the fight headquarters hotel, which was expensive, and I relied on streetcars rather than taxis, kept expenses to the minimum. But I did get to see a lot of Ali. What I found out was that most of the national press, the big guys, don't do a lot of things. I found out when I was covering golf also. I'd go to the golf tournaments, and the guys who were covering the golf, the big time press guys, would sit in the tent where the golfers come after round interviews. I liked to walk out on the course with the golfers. So I got to know, when I was covering golf with Mason Rudolph at Memphis, I got to know Gary Player and Lee Trevino and all these famous golfers because I was out there with them. And I didn't just sit in the tent waiting for the news to come to me. I liked being out there. So I found out when I was covering the heavyweight championship fight that while everybody went to the press room and got the press releases, a lot of them didn't take advantage of some of the opportunities, which was going to watch Ali train some. Or I guess the best thing was the day after the fight. The fight was late at night, and then they had big parties and stuff afterward, and of course press availability. But then I can't remember if it was Angelo Dundee or Bundini Brown. I'd have to look at notes, but they were two of Ali's guys, came into the press room and said that anybody who wanted to, that the champ was tired. He wasn't doing any interviews that night. But if anybody wanted to, they can be at his hotel room at the Hilton at 8 the next morning. Well, it's like 2 or 3 in the morning at this point. So obviously I was going to do that, and I thought a lot of press would. But I got there the next morning. I mean, I got back out to my hotel and got there the next morning at 8, and there were only 2 of us that showed up. Two others other than me. And so just the 3 of us sat there for basically a couple hours just chatting with Muhammad Ali, who did win the fight. And it was just it was an example of how so many of the press people were lazy, or they went out to the French Quarter and spent their whole evening there, and they didn't, it just kind of, I was really troubled that people didn't take that opportunity to be there. But it sure was good for me because I enjoyed it. So that'd be the most memorable, and I've seen Ali a few times, and we're not friends or anything, but I admire him greatly for what he stood for and still stands for. He made mistakes, but he's a good person. The other thing, though, Emily, I guess am I supposed to mention your name? The other thing is a story that influenced my life, and I'll talk about this briefly. But when I was in Clarksville and I was the associate editor, there were, within the course of, there was one year in the late autumn when a young teenage girl, young woman, 16-year-old, I guess that's a girl, she disappeared. And then later in that winter time, they were still looking for her. She actually, they found her car at a parking lot by a church, and nobody ever found her. She was never seen again alive. And then that winter time, a football player at the local university, Austin Peay State University, he also disappeared one night. And basically, then he was only missing for a couple of weeks, but they found, it turned out, in her case, she was stopped by somebody who was posing as a police officer, and she was abducted, and we don't know what happened. Horrible things, I'm sure, happened to her. And then her body was found, parts of her body were found dragged out of the woods by some dogs 4 months later. At the day before, either the day before or the day after, the football player, his body was found by a creek. So these stories were working at the same time, even though she disappeared much sooner. The one day, the football player, his name was Rodney Long, the girl, her name was Kathy Nishiyama. But the football player, he actually had he'd gone to get late night hamburgers at Wendy's and at the drive-thru, and some guys asked him for a ride to the edge of town. And he was a nice kid, apparently. I didn't know him. I know his family. I still just talked to his mom last night. They have that much impact on my life. But he did give these young men his age, a ride to the edge of town, and they're trying to get away from the cops because they were burglars. And so instead of just dumping him and stealing the car, they said he was a real nice guy. In trial, they said he was a real nice guy, but they executed him and took his car. And in Kathy's case, she was abducted by a trustee at a county, not our county, a nearby county jail, and he took a car, one of the sheriff's department cars, for a joyride, and he tried to abduct a number of different people apparently that night, but he got her and killed her. But when they found Rodney's body one day, they found Rodney's wallet one day on the side of an interstate in Knoxville. He was only missing for a couple of weeks. And then the next day, they found Kathy's purse. And then, like a week later, they found Rodney's body in this creek bed in northern Montgomery County, Tennessee, almost outside of Clarksville. And then the next day, they found Kathy's, actually her head, skull, what was left of it, had been dragged out of the woods by dogs. And people actually investigated. They at first thought it was an empty milk, gallon of milk. Her scattered remains, not many of them were found. She was in a very rural area, and why they hurt me deeply, because journalists are naturally cynical and skeptical, but also you hurt a lot, and you have to help. I was a columnist, and I was the editor in charge of these stories, and I got to know the families of both these young people. So I felt like I knew them. I got to know the killers, unfortunately, so I felt like I knew them. And these kind of changed my life in terms of, up until that point, I thought, that everything, I thought like a little town like Clarksville, little town, 100,000 people, but a little city like Clarksville was safe. Everybody was safe. And then you realize all of a sudden that nobody's safe. And then it also changed how I approached my life, how often I locked my doors. Now, as I'm a parent and I have teenage children, these people stay with me. Also, during the course of these crimes and during the coverage of the crimes, I did most of the people side of it. So my best friend now is a police reporter. He's not now. He was a police reporter. He worked for me, and I was the columnist and the editor in charge of these stories. So he would go cover the crime part, and I would cover the people part. So I got to know the mother of the dead football player. I got to know his brothers, his stepfather. I got to know the parents of the dead girl, the young 16-year-old high school kid. And I still keep in touch with them as well, the father particularly. I was telling these stories, trying to help the city. The city also, it wasn't just us, the newsroom, who were shocked, it was the people in the city. And so we were telling I was trying to help the people cope by telling these stories, which took me to funerals and then covered So that's, I don't need to go into more detail on that, but that was just like one story, but they were all wound together, two stories wound together into one in terms of their influence on me. I could go on, but that's probably all you need. Oh, I will tell you one more, okay? This is another one that affected me deeply. I don't remember the year now, but there was one Christmas time in Clarksville, is the home of Fort Campbell, where the 101st Airborne Division is, and I got to know a lot of soldiers and people out there. Well, before all these current wars, our troops were gone overseas as peacekeepers, and we had soldiers who were on the Sinai as peacekeepers right there between Israel and Egypt and all that, and in the Arab countries. And one Christmas time, these guys were coming home for the holidays. 248 soldiers were on this airplane, and six crew members, airplane crew, pilot and stewardesses, etc. I guess you call them flight attendants now. But they landed in Gander, Newfoundland. They flew from the Sinai, from Egypt. I guess they flew out. I can't remember. They flew out of Tel Aviv or Cairo, wherever. But they flew on a commercial jet. They flew to refuel in Gander, Newfoundland, that's a regular place. If you ever fly to Europe, you might land there to refuel. But it was when they took off afterward. They were shopping for Christmas presents for their kids, etc. They were young men, young women, and then as they took off, the plane exploded. The plane crashed and exploded and burned, and and all aboard were killed immediately. They think it was an icing incident, probably. It still could have. There's still some thought that it could have been terrorism, early stages of terrorism. Back then, nobody really thought about terrorists, and it did. That affected me a lot because I had to coordinate the coverage of that first day. I just gotten home when I got the call. I gotten home at 2 or 3 in the morning. I got the call at like 6 or something. Got into work, and I was in charge of the coverage with my boss, who was the editor. I was the associate editor, but we directed the coverage, and we put out a special edition that day, which isn't done very much anymore, an extra. And then we did had all of my people covering stuff, and I went to the first memorial service that night and covered it. It's pretty much, I was on the clock, we were getting paid by the hour. It was like 24 hours before I was in the building from early that morning until well into the next morning with my staff and running on adrenaline and stuff. That affected me too. So I get all those guys, and then after that telling some of their stories. So and there are a lot more, but that's probably enough.